I'm Asia Freeman, Artistic Director of Bunnell Street Arts Center, and it's been my pleasure to host artist talks on most Fridays for many months now. And coming to you live from Denina land, Supiaq land as well, stewarded for thousands of years by people, the ancient Ketchimak peoples of Ketchimak Bay. Um, this is a true pleasure to be visiting with Amy Meissner and many other fiber artists who've joined us for this studio visit. Welcome, Amy. How are
Thank
you
you.
today?
I'm fine, Asia. Thank you so much for hosting. This is exciting to be talking to you again. It's been a little while. So, yeah, it's good. It's good. How do you
So we're
want
in
to
your, well,
begin?
I'd love to just begin by orienting us to your beautiful space. I see that you're in your studio and it all looks perfectly well managed
It does
in the
seem
midst
that
of a
way.
busy summer.
Yeah, so I will, yes, let me orient you to where I am. I'm in my home, which is located on Denina homeland in the place that is currently called Anchorage, where I have the privilege of raising my family, um, knowing that families have been raised here for thousands of years. And that gives me great comfort and so much appreciation. So, so yeah, so my studio is in my home and it's in the basement. It's in a spare bedroom. It's not a fancy space, but it has a door that shuts, which I appreciate, and tall ceilings and okay light. Asia and I were just complaining about the LEDs flaming out. And I also have not really been in the studio for about 2 years. And the reason for that is because I went back to school and I am in the process of completing an MA in critical craft studies through Warren Wilson College, which has been a low residency program to begin with. And what that means is that we all convene twice a year in July and then in January for 2 weeks in Asheville, North Carolina. And of course, this last year, we weren't able to do that. So the program moved 100% online, which was okay. It was fine. For somebody who really loves to be in Alaska, especially in the summertime, it was hard to leave. That first residency, that was really tough. And so that was fine to be home and work from home. But what ended up happening is this space became like the dumping ground for all the repairs that needed to happen, all the mending and all the things that I just didn't know what to do with. They all just ended up in this space. And so as soon as I finished this coursework for this final semester, I still have to do a presentation in July at a symposium that is coming up to be really truly finished with the degree. But yeah, I basically went through this space and another space that I kind of spill out into and emptied all the bins of cloth and went through and like touched every single thing and considered it and refolded it and not even reorganized it. I did get rid of a few things, but not that much. It was just a sort of like, what do I even have in here? I don't even know. And I think that comes with having a deeper understanding of materials and this idea that your interests obviously shift and they change. And so like just reconnecting with space and reconnecting with the materials in that space, I think was really helpful for me. I also did a ton of mending. There was just a pile of stuff that needed to get tended. And so I spent a lot of time doing that, which I'll actually talk about a little bit more. And So yeah, so it just feels good to kind of get back into this space and try to figure out what's next, because I don't really know right now. I don't I don't 100% know. So it's always scary when you've stopped a big project and you don't have something else lined up, because you do feel a little bit adrift, right? So, oh, you're muted.
Here I am. I muted. A large truck went by here in Old Town, so I muted myself. I would love to know a little bit more about your MA program. I think probably many people are curious. I did a low residency master's program as well. And so I'm just very curious about how that works for Alaskans, what the structure was like. And you had mentioned that it had been difficult to really be in the studio for a couple years. So how was it? Was it very theoretical like mine was? Lots of writing and reading and talking and processing?
Yeah, it was. It's a research-based program,
Mhm.
and while um, my interest wasn't, I didn't join the program because I wanted to do research necessarily. I think I naturally do research. I think artists naturally do research anyway. Um, but boy, I got a lot out of that um, learning process. I mean, it was incredible. I think for me, I was really trying to nail down for myself, not even the difference between art and craft, but just kind of coming to a personal definition of art and craft and where the work that I do fits in, and kind of coming to this realization. And I was really tired of even having that debate, like art versus
Yeah.
craft. Like, I'm just really, really tired of it. And the people in this program are as well. And this is an opportunity to um, cultivate craft research that goes in a different direction, and isn't trying to compete with the way that art and art history is talked about and researched and written about. It is taking like just sort of a completely different um, way of looking at things and looking at history and the multiple histories and multiple layers that can be told through craft. And
Mhm.
that really appealed to me because I do have a literary arts background, and narrative is really important to me with regards to my personal practice, um, but also just in terms of narrative that's inherent in the handmade object, and working with textiles in particular made by unknown women. There are so many narratives that are lost, completely lost. So what are you left with? You're left with the work itself, you're left with the materials, you're left with maybe you know where it was made, or you know maybe when it was made, even if you don't know who made it. And um, it's interesting to start thinking about how to take that little tiny bit of information and start to generate, if not the true narrative, um, a narrative that fits into a larger cultural sphere. And that's pretty interesting to me. And I think it's work that I was heading towards already, but this program um, helped me put a language to it and try to understand what the potential was for the work
Mhm.
that I want to do and that I was doing. And yes, a lot of writing, and a lot of writing academic essays that were not, particularly the kind of writing that I wanted to do. Certainly felt uncomfortable to do, but were good for me anyway.
Yeah.
I think you learn so much more about your work by through the writing process.
Mhm.
So
I'm interested to explore, to listen, to hear more about your definition of craft and art and the interface that feels comfortable to you at some point in this studio visit, perhaps while we're looking at some
yeah, I
more
mean,
or
I
whatever
think
you.
I think that will probably emerge, and I'll definitely keep that in mind, because it's still evolving for me too. I
Mhm.
know that I feel comfortable with a definition that is, an artist with a craft-based practice. To me, that feels really comfortable to sit with right now.
Mhm.
And I think for a long time I was calling myself a textile artist, which didn't really sit well with me for a long time. I didn't really, and somebody finally asked me, like, why are you even calling yourself that? Why aren't you just calling yourself an artist? And the textile part was really important to me, not because of the textiles, but because of the labor and the skill
Yeah.
set that goes along with textiles. And so to just sort of reframe it a little bit and refer to myself as an artist with a craft-based practice, I think it opens up maybe a broader understanding or even a more curiosity about the kind of work that I'm doing. Because, what is craft? Craft is skill, and it's material understanding, and it's a relationship with materials, and it's a relationship to the skill itself. I can't remember who said this, but it's a definition that I think about a lot. Art is imagination with or without skill. Craft is skill with or without imagination. And I think that's interesting because within those definitions, if you think of it in terms of like an X and a Y axis, I'm at any point in that constellation. Sometimes I'm doing repetitive work that doesn't take a lot of imagination, but it does have a lot of skill behind it. And then there are other times where it's all conceptual and there's not I'm not making anything, I'm thinking about it, right? And so that becomes the imagination without a lot of actual like hands-on skill. So at any point in that constellation or on that XY axis, which I prefer to think of it that way, it's kind of like gender, right? If you think about gender on an axis, an XY axis, it just opens up so many more ways of being fluid, right? And so I guess I've been thinking about it in that way too, rather than on a spectrum with like craft on this side and art on this side and you're somewhere on a line. I mean, that's not realistic.
Yeah.
So so these are kind of the things that I've been thinking about and sitting with and wondering about on the sort of the broader landscape of craft, but then also for myself as someone who practices in that landscape. I think it's good to think about and figure out where you not fit in all the time, but fit in some of the time, and where you can stretch these conversations and these relationships with materials and other people and other makers so that you're not just on one point.
Yeah. It really makes me think about how my work at Benel, working with and representing artists like yourself and so many others around the state who have a really well-developed craft-based practice, has taught me so much as a person who, yeah, I did come from a home where craftsmanship is really valued, especially around things like wooden boats and textiles. But when I got involved with Benel, the potters and the people involved in textiles and painters were kind of coming from different places on a spectrum, and that wasn't very conducive to any kind of comfort or clarity about how I might represent artists. I didn't want this sort of polarizing kind of dialogue to continue, and I really feel like I owe it to the artists with a strong craft-based practice, um, who helped me imbue appreciation and language and forms of articulation that elevate the craftsmanship of every good thing that we're privileged to represent here, whether it is a painting, a sculpture, an ephemeral event. What does it mean for something to be well crafted?
Absolutely.
Researched, researched, time-based, thoughtful. A lot of that may happen in one's head, but
Sure.
it's a respect for histories and traditions and stories, and that
And
makes
that's what I
sense.
love about, this kind of migratory quality of craft itself is it is, these skill-based acts that used to be so centered in the home, and particularly repair, because that is where my practicum project centered on was repair in the circumpolar north. And I'll show some images of that work that I did, particularly in the last year. But to take repair out of the center of the home, to take craft out of the center of the home, puts it on the margins, and it doesn't allow for this understanding of how much time and how much labor is brought into that practice. And it's not just the labor that's in front of you and the time that's in front of you, it's this sort of collapsed time, because it's all of the hours that led up to this moment of work and all of the other hands that taught your hands how to do that work. And so there's this generational quality and migratory quality. If you look at craft practices that are happening in other parts of the world, I'll just take darning, for example, since my brain is always on repair, or even just stitching. I mean, there's only so many stitches that are used. And really, when you look at the number of stitches that people really use all the time, there are maybe like 4 or 3. And those are across the globe. They've migrated from place to place, or they're just inherent in terms of the tools themselves and the materials themselves. That's just what you can do with those things. And so I just find that endlessly fascinating. So I'll go ahead and share my screen, and we can talk about some of this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, is that a full screen?
Yes.
Great. So this is what my desk looked like for the last 2 years. That is research and notes and writing and Zooming. For me in Alaska, that a lot of times meant jumping on the computer at 6 in the morning or 7 in the morning to meet with my cohort, who was mostly on the East Coast. And I had one faculty member who was actually in Paris. And so it would be very late at night for him and very early in the morning for me. And so this is kind of what I was living for, the last 4 semesters. Also, kids were home doing Zoom classes. It was pretty crazy. And I find myself actually now even wandering around, wondering if, wondering what, I should be doing something that feels, manic and overly productive, or I should be reading something, or I should be, so it's been hard for me to settle. One of the things that did happen, which I think most of us can relate to, is, your body just sort of takes over when you really need to rest. And so I ended up with the last couple weeks, being unable to move my neck. And I think what happened, I think the last certainly year and a half of pandemic, everything just lodged in my neck finally. And then that was it. And so, I've been going to the chiropractor, and I've been, really trying hard to protect my neck. And so what that made me do too is slow down with all the things I thought I was going to do in my studio, because it was hurting my neck. And it also forced me to make sure I wasn't picking up my phone very often, because that also hurts my neck. And so, I ended up, there were times where I was just literally just sitting over the last week or so, which was actually really good for me. So this is the Chattermarks Journal that is published by the Anchorage Museum. And for the last year, I was a Northern Research Lab fellow through the Anchorage Museum. Julie Decker was my mentor for 2 semesters through this MA program, which was incredible. And I had the opportunity to guest edit issue number 3 of the Chattermarks Journal, which is called The State of Repair. And it looks at repair in the circumpolar north through collections in various institutions within Alaska, but then also pulls from other projects. They're on the, what would that be? That's the lower right-hand corner. For example, is the Indigenuity Project that is a couple of years old, but it's done by Joar Nango and Silja Figenshu Thorsen, who are in Norway, and they looked at Sami indigenous communities and this amazing way that we can, many of us relate to here in Alaska, of reuse and reinterpretation of materials and structures and objects to better suit the user. So their work took repair and kind of expanded on that definition of repair and reuse and reconfiguration, which was great. There was contemporary artists who are working with repair that are looking at materials that are very much of place. So this moose hide thimble that is there on the left was made by a woman named Siku Alulu, who lives in Canada. And she is working, or at that time was working on repairing a piece of artwork that she had made out of sealskin and tent canvas. And the artwork itself is very much about emotional repair and cultural repair for herself. Not cultural repair is not the right way of putting it, but repair of the self in terms of understanding where she fits into a multicultural background that she has. And then this piece up above the Indigenuity Project is part of an essay that I wrote that is looking at this broken rug that I have as part of a family story, which I can share with you a little bit later. So there were a number of images from archives and interviews, and then essays that were commissioned, essays that were reprinted, and I'm pretty proud of this project. So had the opportunity to work with Karen Larson, who is the designer of the Chattermarks Journal. I think they're in issue number 4. They're working on it right now. So it's an ongoing project for the museum, and it's exciting that they have a publication. It's also available online. So if you, I don't have the URL listed here, but if you even just Google Chattermarks Journal, Anchorage Museum, it will come up right away. And then you can click on issue 3 and you can look through it online. You can read the whole thing online. So I will be presenting this project in July as like the final stage of my MA program, and right before I get to graduate on August 1st or 2nd, I think. And all that's happening online. It had to be planned so far in advance that nobody wanted to take any chances that we wouldn't be able to meet. So that's actually just fine.
Well, you've found a format to work that's so conducive, to share, the print format and the design.
Yeah, I know. And it's,
pages.
yeah, it was great that, the early conversations with Julie about what my practicum project could look like. We were really talking about curating, and having an exhibition that probably would have been opening like right around now. And then we had that conversation in about February or January of 2020. And then everything shifted and had to change. And of course, Julie is so generous and so just so able to think on her feet and so able to pivot, that she was the one who suggested this format. And it was great. I mean, I Zoomed with potential contributors. I emailed people, there were people who were in Norway and Estonia, and and it was all done online. So that part was great. It was a lot to manage. It was a lot to keep organized. And when I think back on it, I can't even believe it's done and that it happened. So so that was the most recent project that has kept me out of my studio, especially over the last year. And then this is a project that I completed a year ago. And after my first 2 semesters of school, I had a little bit of time. And of course, we were in the middle of early stages of the pandemic. Anchorage Museum had reached out to a number of artists about doing commissioned work for Future Ready, which I think as a project, I'm not entirely sure how that's going to take shape, if that will be another journal, if it will be an exhibition, I'm not entirely sure. But I ended up making these 4 pandemic suits, and then having Brian Adams photograph my family in them. And we were primarily out in the landscape taking these photographs. And it's this kind of ridiculous idea that you need to bundle up your children in order to keep them safe out in the middle of nowhere. And yet that's very much where my head was when I first started making these suits. Is like, the project is called Mother Thought of Everything. And so, yes, of course, you would take every single thing that you had available to you, no matter how ridiculous or how meager, and every skill that was available to you, again, no matter how ridiculous or how meager, and create something that would keep your children safe from this unknown pathogen or danger that is lurking in the world. And so these are made of Tyvek, the actual quilt top. And these were quilt tops that were donated to me. They were unfinished, so there was never any batting or anything with them when they came to me. They were just the tops. So they actually almost stand by themselves. They're very, very stiff. They're very hot to wear. And it really gave all of us a sense of what PPE actually feels like to wear. There's absolutely no breathability. You could feel the sweat just dripping down your back whenever you put these things on. And yeah, so it was really, I don't know if I would call it performance art, but there was an aspect to it that that felt very performative. To put these on, you automatically stood differently. You automatically started regulating your breathing because you couldn't breathe through the mouth or the face covering very well. It was very thick and yeah, uncomfortable. So I guess I thought I would throw these in just to show a little bit of process, because there is no pattern for PPE out in the world. And so these were patterns that I had to make and adapt some blocks that I had for other things. So this is the hood of the baby. And you can see basically what I had to do is make a full Tyvek suit and then take the whole thing apart. And then that became the inner structure for each suit. So it has sort of this multi-step process to go through, because they're all different sizes. And so it's not like I just pumped out 4 and they were all the same. They're all different sizes. And so this is an example of draping. So it's the way that I was taught to actually work on a mannequin making wedding gowns. So you do all this pinning and working with a basic block pattern. And then you take all that apart. The Tyvek was super fun to work with because you didn't have to worry about it, the fabric fraying or anything like that. And then I stitched everything down, and then, you end up cutting it apart to see where all the darts go and everything, and working with, trial and error until you get it looking the way that you want it to look. And then I would take the whole thing apart, and each piece then would get the quilt pieces put on top. So the baby was the last one that I made. And that's kind of working with these quilt tops and then stitching together this little baby suit.
Mhm.
So that's the other part of my studio that's in the other. So I have two cutting tables that I work on.
And
Yeah.
the pieced suits haven't been displayed yet. They're beautifully documented in those photographs, though,
Yeah,
the collapse.
Brian took incredible photographs. And so eventually, um, I think what will end up happening is, and I don't actually know, I shouldn't even say, but my hope is that they will be exhibited at the museum, either part of a larger exhibition that looks at this concept of future ready, which they had been talking about as early as December 2019 or even earlier than that. So like pre-pandemic, they were already thinking about, what does it take to be future ready? And then this pandemic happened. So it kind of got put on hold and yet became even more resonant, I think. So when they do finally put something together, I'm not entirely sure how it will be, but I'm envisioning the suits on their own. And then, of course, all of Brian's incredible photographs to accompany, which I think would be really beautiful because they start to really tell a tender, I'll just flip back up here, tender story about motherhood and family and siblings and place and just, that the unknowing or not knowing, that we were all experiencing during this time, this idea of wanting to hide your children.
Mhm.
They became very camouflaged when they were against this graffitied wall and yet totally out of place when you were in the middle of the land.
Mhm.
Yeah. So the other thing I thought I would talk about is just materials, because I'm always thinking about materials. And um, one of the things that my family does every summer is clean beaches, even if it's just a little bit. Like we don't go to a beach ever without cleaning it up as much as we can. Sometimes we can clean it up a lot. Sometimes we can haul a lot of net and junk. Other times we can't because it's not safe. Either um, the debris is too heavy or it's too big. Like we have found like refrigerator doors and just crazy stuff that you can't haul with our little dinghy and our little boat. So with 4 people at least on the boat certainly makes it tight. So we haul what we can and dispose of it, but I'm always thinking of it in terms of potentiality. Most of it, I would say like 99.5% of it, I don't use. But every once in a while, things linger in my studio because I'm interested in what they might become,
Mhm.
and I'm certainly always looking at the other materials of place. So I feel like the garbage becomes a material of place, even though it's not wanted. It's traveled to that place, but then it becomes a material of place. But then the other things that are inherent to place, that remains, and certainly the natural world, are always really um, resonant for me. And I think I used to think a lot more about material agency in this sort of like woo-woo sense. And I don't so much anymore, but I do really believe that there is a moment where a found object becomes a material. And I'm still kind of working through that in terms of thinking about material agency and what needs to be in place for myself as someone who works with found objects to even see it as a potential material. And I think that being out completely unplugged, for example, makes a big difference because you're just so much your senses are so much more heightened when you're out on the water or in a remote location, because you're always thinking about other things, like broader things like safety issues and where are the kids and should they be on those rocks, and is there a bear, are we too close to the stream, do you have reception, do I have cell reception, no, do I have a satellite phone, like what's happening with the tides, what's happening with the water. And I think you're just like so heightened, your senses are so on. And I think that's the time where, if there is this material agency, that's where it can kind of grab a person. And it certainly does that for me. And I think having that openness while I'm out there in particular, and those quiet times, really, really helps me think through the conceptual component of the work that I do. So this piece, which I think showed at the Bunnell in October, as part of a group show called Fragile Domestic, was very much about weight. And when I was working on it, that whole inside section is filled with stones. And I actually put it on my head just to kind of see, like, this feels really heavy. And it really was heavy to wear it over your head. Just to have that really physical experience was very telling and helped inform the work even further.
So can you talk about material agency in the woo-woo sense and distinguish it? Because I think that's a really fascinating.
Yeah, I think that there has been a lot of writing. I'm thinking of like Jane Bennett, who wrote a really fascinating book called Vibrant Matter. And yeah, and it's this, this materials having their own lives and the ability to change us, right? And I think that an act upon us. And there have been other people who've written about material agency, but she's the one that pops into my mind. And it can get a little bit woo-woo in terms of like, oh, the material is speaking to me, and or I'm really drawn to this for some reason. And I think I used to be a little bit more open to, like, yeah, I'm really connecting with this, this rock or this fabric or whatever, and it's speaking to me, or it's whispering to me, or whatever. And I'm kind of like, I don't think so much it was. I think that my brain was at that moment empty enough to receive histories and receive thoughts that were coming from other things that I'd seen or read. And yeah, I mean, this is something I'm still kind of thinking through, like, and I think that the work or the materials that I use are, so much of them are found objects. And so even the textiles, they've all had former lives or former uses. And so there is that kind of resonance, I guess, that kind of comes with objects and things that have had former lives. But is the material itself have agency? I don't know. Like, I'm still kind of up in the air about that. But I know that for myself, like, I can look at something one day and like a rock and say, oh, it's a rock. And I can look at it the next day and it's like, oh no, this is what it needs to be. And I think that shift is less about the rock and it's more about me and where my headspace is.
Yeah, it does. I mean, it seems like it mirrors the ongoing kind of dialectic between like essentialism and constructivism. Is there this inherent nature or quality to being female, to being a rock, to being grass or fiber, just for example, versus the cultural overlays that basically prescribe and constrain ideas of like gender and material, and in what ways do we project those properties onto things and then sort of feel them back because they resonate back to us so powerfully based on cultural experience.
And I think too, so much of it for me, when you say like resonating back, or that there is that sort of feedback loop that I find only through the making. You can think about things all you want, but it isn't until you actually are in it and handling and making where so much of it is further revealed for me at that point. I so many times, I mean, maybe 100% of the time, go into a project thinking this is going to be about this, or, or these are the things I want to explore. And then hours and hours and hours later, days later, months later, I emerge with a finished object and realize, oh no, this is about something completely different, or it's about something that's actually, yes, but also adjacent. And I think that just being open to that is really productive for me. And it's hard because that is the not knowing, right? And that feels really uncomfortable. It feels more comfortable to say, I'm going to make a thing that is about this, and then make that thing. But then you are making to theme, right? There's no room for expansiveness or further ideas to not to use a craft metaphor, but weave themselves in, with other ideas that that I think is really, really important. So these are things that I'm still thinking about, and because certainly I have been in situations where materials have made themselves known, in a way that felt really magical, but the reality of it is I was probably receptive to potentiality in a way, for some reason, more so than I would have been on another day or in another time. So that's kind of where I'm at with that. Always thinking about rocks, always thinking about combining rocks. I don't know why I insist on making these heavy things, but I'm still kind of working with this idea of like, what if I do this? What if I do this? How does this work? How can I put these things together and have them not fall apart? That's the other thing. Like rocks and textiles don't necessarily go together. So how can they? How many ways can I embed a found object in a textile work and have it still accomplish what I want it to accomplish? So these were made in the summer of 2019. These are called a series of tripping hazards that look very much like a coronavirus. That was not the intention. I didn't even know what a coronavirus was in 2019. But I was thinking about them in terms of toys and things that, if you have one of, it's fine. You can hold on to it. You can put it someplace. But what happens when you have a dozen of them and they become unmanageable? So objects like toys or things that you would trip over that accumulate around you are interesting to me. It's also interesting to me to make more than one of something. And so there's a lot of repetition in my work. There's a lot of repetition in stitch, in language. Even the piece that's kind of blurry, but behind these objects is all about repetition and doing the same thing over and over and over. And some of that is just me really wanting to understand the skill part of how I do this thing. How do you applique wool letters onto old cloth? How do you cover these found objects and make them look a certain way? And that just comes from repetition. Plus, I also think it's interesting to have more than one of something. When you start to have a group of things, I think they become interesting. This is another some process images of a piece that that I did, I think in 2018 or 19, called Birth Weight, 8 pounds, 4 ounces. So altogether, these stones weigh about the same amount as kind of an average newborn, a little heavier. That's Brian Adams taking a photograph. I always take photos of Brian taking photos because they're so funny. So he's in his socks standing on top of my studio, like cutting table. So yeah, just sort of thinking about like how do you swaddle a stone? How do you make this hard object have a softness to it and have a resonance to and a nod to the amount of labor now that you have just put into this valueless object, right? The rock itself has no value, but now you have just imbued it with so much time and so much care and so much labor. So, how do you show that? How do you reveal that through cloth and stitch, and still make the work really, really fine? Um, I am a person who it will be really rare to find very many raw edges in the work that I do. And it's not because I don't like raw edges. It's just that for whatever reason, I have a hard time um, being satisfied with that. So I tend to make everything really clean. And so there's a balance that has to happen between really clean and tidy and chaotic. And I want things to look chaotic, and yet I want them to look really tidy. So I'm always trying to sort of balance those things. And then the last thing that I wanted to talk about, which kind of circles back around to the work that I've been doing for the last year anyway, is to talk about repair and how much repair is part of my practice. And I think that it's interesting to think about futures and how repair fits into our future and um, our world's future. We are constantly consuming and consuming and consuming, and not prolonging, particularly textiles, particularly clothing. That's where my background is, and so that's what I think about the most. But yeah, like, how can we um start thinking about our relationship to our possessions in terms of prolonging and longevity and care? And so this coat is actually Julia O'Malley's coat. It's a long, knee length, very beautiful Lululemon down coat that her new pandemic puppy jumped up onto and cut two L-shaped holes in that she had quickly covered up with duct tape. And so I went through and I repaired her coat for her, and it felt so nice to do that work. And so so that's a process image of that. This is my sister's boyfriend's merino wool sweater. This was a couple of Christmases ago, and hadn't really had an opportunity to connect with him too much. They live in San Diego, but while I mended his sweater for him, which he was just going to wear, I'm like, Chris, you can't wear this. It's going to blow out even more. This is a really nice sweater. Let me fix it. So we were at my mom's house. She had all the tools that I would need. And he sat next to me the whole time while I repaired it for him. And it didn't take that long. It took, an hour and a half or something, but we talked and I got to know him better. And it was just a really tender time, right, in terms of caring for this object, but also caring for this other person that that I was just getting to know. So this is the sweater repaired. And this last one is,
So Amy, I'm
yeah,
thinking about I just wanted to ask you,
yeah.
as you're talking about these things, you've spent so many years building these really beautifully wrought objects through labor, and, in many cases, letting them go as they're collected and, sent, far away, or maybe even near, but they're not in your home. And it's like the creation of these, you know, material, but also, important kind of personal experiences. And I wonder if in this repair work, there's sort of like this pausing or this rethinking about just the idea of generating stuff, even of your own making,
Oh,
um,
totally.
to value the relationship so much.
I think I have I have a lot of thoughts about making and how much I should be making. How much should we be making? And to be constantly making and putting things out into the world is complicated for me. And so that's one of the reasons why I think I'm so insistent on using old cloth or found objects, so that at least I am not participating in, I know like where my materials are coming from. You know, I have like a good sense that it's not all coming from the store, right? It's not all coming from, like, some of it is because it has to, but not all of it is. And so that is something that's been really important to me for a long time. I also didn't really have what I guess could be called social practice, right? I didn't have a social practice that that I could define. And so with repair, and particularly teaching repair, and even more specifically teaching repair in person pre-pandemic, the work that I was doing through the Seed Lab at the Anchorage Museum in particular, was really important, because people want to know how to do this kind of work. And even if they didn't go on to do it themselves or feel comfortable to do it themselves, the thing that I really wanted to foster was this idea that repair could and should be a first response. And so even if you weren't going to be the one repairing it, if you didn't know how, you still, your first response was to, well, find someone who could. And I think that craftspeople in particular are so poised to be able to take on repair and that role of repair in a way that makes a lot of sense. You know, they have the material understanding, they have the skill, they have, you know, the thousands and thousands of hours of understanding, building, and process, that to take on a repair project for a craftsperson is not that difficult. Most people don't want to take on repair because you open up something and you don't really know what you're going to get into. And it does take a really long time. I am still circling around this rug that is a family heirloom in some ways. It's made from denim and plaid shirts that had belonged to two of my mom's cousins who were killed in a car accident. And the making of this rug, along with many, many others, was my great aunt's way of grieving. And it broke while it was in my care. And so I have no idea how to fix this, but I keep circling it because I think it's important enough to fix or make two rugs out of, or, you know, and I'm thinking about, like, how many objects are still made with repair in mind, right? A rug like this, you can repair because they wear out. You end up making two rugs, or you do something like that with it. Like, that is a way that repair is inherently part of the object. But there's very little that is made anymore that has that as even an option. Mm-hmm. So yeah, so these are things that I'm working with and thinking about. This is my sister's jacket that was eaten by an ex-boyfriend's dog, you know, so these are like these histories, right? And so what I've been doing is, when I do these repair projects, I've been posting them on Instagram and talking to people about them. And, like, this is how I approached it. And this is a way of dealing with it. And just in the hopes that it starts to change people's perceptions of what is garbage and what is salvageable. Because so this I thought was garbage. And then the more I looked at it and the more I lived with it, it took me a while to even get to it. But I had to think about it for a long time, because, you know, I can't, this is a snap. It's a special snap that I can't get anywhere. So I can't pull it out and replace it, but I could put a big patch over it and think about how to retain that peg-like shape coming through. So this is the jacket repaired. All the zippers had to be replaced, these patches, everything. So so there's ways of having a social practice that is repair. I'm going to stop sharing here.
Well, and you know, there's a really interesting question that Beth Blankenship brought up here. I'm thinking about, like, her question, which I'll get to in a second, but also the engineering that's going on in these repairs, which it seems are approximating as best as possible this sort of like very long, you know, the the life intended for the object, this long life through very, very careful slowing down and reconstructing that object, right, for a full life. But then Beth raised this question. You make a lot of multiples. Do the artwork show the process of the changes in your stitch approach, or do you do that all beforehand? Example, stitching the other letters on the stitches around on and the stitches around the rocks for tripping hazards. So there's this kind of shift in the mark making there.
Mhm.
But then you have
Yeah.
this, as a
Well,
counterpoint, you
yeah,
have
and I think it goes back, thanks for asking that, Beth. I think it goes back to that idea of what do I want to look chaotic and what do I want to look controlled or even invisible, right?
Mhm.
And that also kind of dovetails with thoughts on repair. I mean, there's a lot of people doing visible repair right now, and they want it for so many different reasons, want the repair to show. But just as many people put more value on a repair that is invisible. I asked my sister, I'm like, oh, can we make like all the repair that I do on this like a color? And she's like, no. It wasn't enough that I was like doing it out of the goodness of my heart. She still wanted it to
Be
not be
invisible.
noticeable. And so I think, there you always have to have you just have to think about it, right? I think visible mending is a really great gateway, right? It's a really great way for people to enter that kind of craft. And as they get better at it, then it can become more invisible if they want, right? But it's nice to be able to have both, right? Um, and so with regards to the decisions that I make about the artwork that I do, yeah, there are definitely decisions, like what I call it the precision decision, like what is going to be so precise that it's actually invisible and what is going to be so chaotic that that is the thing that comes to the forefront. So those are decisions that are made sometimes beforehand entirely, but a lot of times become uh, something that I realize needs to happen while I'm engaged in the process itself. Sometimes something is too perfect or it's too precise or it's too clean or it's too tidy, and that's where I realize I need to go back in and become chaotic elsewhere or at some point in the piece itself.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Amy, it's been so exciting to talk with you today. I've loved being in your studio and thinking about it sort of being like the very center of the house. I mean, it's underneath this bigger structure, but it is like this very enveloping space that feels so beautifully stewarded, even with its piles of
It
research
feels
and
that way to me too.
mending.
Yeah. It's good to be back in here.
That's fantastic. Well, super excited to go to the studio with you today and to welcome others in that space. I wanted to invite you all to return to this dialogue in mid-July when we'll be talking along the theme of Mother Artist on July 16th with Brianna Allen, Maisha Callan Freet, and Carla Cope, 3 artists of different media in Alaska. Thank you all so much for joining us. Amy,
Yeah, thank you
what
so
a
much for
treat.
attending. Yeah, this was great. Thank you so much, Asia.
Absolutely.